So we've just been told where the mind shouldn't rest. The mind being the attention. The attention is always on something. Even in a dream, the attention is focused on something. At any moment you can ask yourself, what is your attention on? And it's usually actually flitting between lots of things. It might be on this video at the moment, you might be watching me, but at the same time you might be wondering how long you're going to look at this for, or if there's something more interesting, or maybe you fancy a snack. The attention is always on something, it's always flitting around between things. Could we remove it from everything? How can we stop the attention from doing this? This is why it's quite nice just to hypnotise the attention. Sit and watch a movie, which isn't going to be too demanding. Read a good book, get lost in a good book. This is our way of escaping from this restlessness, hypnotise the attention. But there's one other option, and this is the option that the Yoga Vasishta is pointing out. The mind should rest in pure consciousness as pure consciousness, with just a little externalized movement of thought, as if aware of the utter vanity of the objects of this world. So the mind should rest in pure consciousness as pure consciousness. And where does the mind find this pure consciousness? Well, that's what happens when the attention looks for itself, when the attention turns right back on itself. This is when the mind stops and the attention is attending to itself. This is consciousness, being conscious of itself, awareness, being aware of itself. So this is the mind resting in pure consciousness as pure consciousness. And it says with just a little externalized movement of thought. In other words, you're going to have to entertain notions of external objects, of an external world now and again, because you have to interact, you have to get on with certain functions, and that's a useful way of thinking about things. Just as in science, it's useful to think in terms of atoms and molecules and subatomic particles. That's not the reality of most of us. It's a scientific reality, and it's very useful if you're developing technology or whatever to think in these terms. So in the same way for us, it's useful to think in terms sometimes of an external world, of an individual self, but it's not reality. And we have to be aware of that so we don't get attached to that. And it says, as if aware of the utter vanity of the objects of this world. The objects of this world try to seduce us. They try to say things like, you'll be happy if you've got me. You'll be happy if you pursue me. Aren't I nice? Don't you want me? Don't you want to possess me? But once we realise the utter vanity, this is vanity of the world, it's sometimes called the glamour of the world. The glamour is like a magical spell which enchants us and sucks us into it, and we forget who we are, we forget our nature, we forget our reality. So we engage, we get involved, but we realise the utter vanity of the objects of this world. When thus all attachments have been snapped, the jiva becomes no-jiva. The jiva is the individual psyche, or the soul even. And that is also a notion, a very deeply embedded notion, a notion that we're so attached to that you probably just cannot take on board the fact that it's a notion, that you're a notion. And you become no-jiva because you've let that notion go. You're no longer identified with a personal identity. Whatever happens thereafter happens, whether activity or inactivity. In such a state of non-attachment, the jiva is not bound to the fruits of action. And this is what's referred to as non-action. When you're acting but with no personal investment, that's when you can get truly involved. It's sometimes called non-action. Or abandoning even that state of a little comprehension of the objects, let the jiva rest in supreme peace. So when you don't need to be doing anything, when you have moments, and there are probably more of them than you realise, when you have moments where you don't need to be doing anything, then we don't need to bother about the external world, and we can rest in this self, which is free from all agitation. Such a liberated person, whether he appears to others to be engaged in activity or not, is forever free from sorrow and fear. All the people love and adore him. Even if in the eyes of others he appears to be agitated, within himself he's firmly rooted in wisdom. It might seem strange that such a person would appear to be agitated, but this person, just as they've got a certain colour of skin or colour of hair, shape of nose, they'll have certain psychological traits, certain personality traits, and these traits might well carry on. They're what are splashing over the awareness of the liberated person. The question then arises, well, if such a person is liberated, then surely and if they're established in this supreme peace, then surely that should be apparent in their behaviour, in their psychology. And I think it is apparent, but it's probably in quite a subtle level, and it might be very hard to discern. What should be apparent is they're not feeding neuroses, they're not feeding anxieties. They might express anxieties, they might express certain neuroses, because that's part of their psychology, but they're not feeding it. They're not feeding it, they've got a perspective on it. So it's quite a subtle distinction. His consciousness is ever uncoloured by happiness and unhappiness. He is not distracted by the glamour of the world. Having attained self-knowledge, he lives in constant contemplation, as it were, and therefore he is unattached to anything in the universe. Having risen above the pairs of opposites, he appears to be as if in deep sleep, even in the wakeful state.